Welcome. I'm Jason,
I'm Kai.
and today we're here on Conversations to talk with SB Divya.
Hello.
So,
Thank you.
Divya is an author, an engineer, has a background in data science and signal processing, and we're just really glad that she's come to join us today after we saw her speak at the World Science Fiction Convention. Um, we saw her in a talk about sentience and AI and how we can think about different types of intelligence and sentience and all of that cool stuff. So, I want to start off this conversation with the question of how did you get interested in sentience, machine intelligence as a space?
Back in college, I entered Caltech with dreams of becoming an astrophysicist, and I was physics major, like about half of the incoming class. Um, and after about 2 years, I was not feeling as confident in the space of physics as I would have liked. And at the time, there was a new interdisciplinary department there called computational neuroscience. And I found that really fascinating. I felt like the universe at large was a space that we had a lot of discoveries to make, but so was the brain. The brain was very much a mystery, just as much as cosmology and particle physics. I ended up switching over to work with that department. I constructed my own major. I had to have 3 advisors. Um, but it was really cool because I got to do physics, I got to do electrical engineering and computer science, and I got to do all the biology, including neuroscience. And I learned about neural networks. I learned about cognition. I learned about, like base neurochemistry, cellular stuff. And it inspired a lifelong fascination with the subject of what happens here and how do we put those tiny biochemical pieces and synaptic level activity with the experience of all life around us. And one of my advisors was Christoph Koch, who went on to talk a lot about consciousness. He's still working on trying to come up with models we can use to describe consciousness, to turn it into a system and mathematics and science that we can actually study. He's now left Caltech a few years ago and is at the Allen Brain Institute. I've just been fascinated ever since. After I left college, I became more of a traditional engineer. I was working in digital signal processing, medical devices, and high-speed communications. My master's degree was much more of a traditional electrical computer engineering signal processing major. But I never lost my interest in this particular topic. And over the last few years, it's been really gratifying to see AI as a business term really kind of come into its stride. I graduated in the late 90s, which was kind of the first dot-com peak. But at that point, there were not a ton of companies working on neural networks. We didn't have the computational power. And even after we did have the computational power, we didn't have the data until I would say the last 5 years. And that's why we've kind of seen this explosion or renaissance of ideas where we've taken sort of the foundational concepts that were built in the 70s, 80s, and 90s mathematically and turned it into practical applications. With those practical applications, I think have come a lot of potential pitfalls, dangers, ethical conundrums, and those are the kinds of things that are fascinating me right now in fiction. And then for supplemental income, because fiction doesn't pay all that well compared to technology, I continue to work in the tech sector. I left my signal processing job back in 2016 after publishing Runtime to focus a little bit more on writing. And then as I saw more and more people getting into machine learning and data science, I was feeling a little bereft because I was like, this is my passion and I'm not working with it. So I went back to work part-time a couple of years ago, and I've been doing AI in the business sense for a company that does sleep monitoring through the Apple Watch. And so I do a little bit of signal processing type stuff for them, and I do a lot of the data science side of trying to come up with ways to provide insights to people using sort of the modern statistics and machine learning techniques.
So you said AI in the business sense, and I really want to unpack that because I'm pretty sure, as somebody else who does, I also do a lot of AI in business. I think I know what you mean, but can you help explain that just a little?
Sure. So, coming from the background I come from, I guess, machine learning is what I would really consider the use of things like neural networks, right? Deep neural networks, convolutional neural networks, all of these are ways that we have basically used biomimetics, right? Looking at how roughly we think the brain works and trying to recreate that in a computer system so that the computer can learn and process inputs and produce outputs and classifications the way we do. AI, the way a lot of businesses use it today in terms of advertising that our software or our product is AI driven, is not always necessarily using those types of machine learning. Many times they're just using what I would consider really adaptive statistics, very, very complex statistics, things like logistic regressions where you actually are doing some amount of stochastic or statistical adaptation, but not necessarily what I would consider the building blocks of a true machine learning system, and definitely not the um, popular conception of what AI is as driven by science fiction, as driven by Hollywood, especially, right? When we think of artificial intelligence, we're thinking, Asimov's robots or the Terminator or, you know, HAL, unfortunately, and Skynet. It's all bad, right? Especially in Hollywood. But that kind of AI is definitely not what your average business is anywhere close to approaching with their systems or their software when they say we are AI driven, right? What they really mean is we are using large amounts of data, highly sophisticated statistical analysis, and if you're very lucky, maybe some neural networks.
There's a cartoon that was floating around the internet that a former coworker shared with me because we talked a lot about this distinction between business AI and AI. That was, the Scooby Doo gang with, AI, and they pull off the mask. And it was statistical analysis all along. And
Yeah.
that does feel very much like the business attitude towards AI. But that's, yeah, today I feel like let's talk about the real stuff, the deep stuff. Not just, we can do statistics that most people don't understand, and so they think it's magic.
Right. Well, and I would say, it's funny that we make that a dichotomy because I'm not sure that it necessarily is. I think even what most of us do biologically in terms of how we navigate reality and our own intelligence systems probably are really sophisticated statistics at the end of the day. Arguably, even something like a neural network is really maybe more stochastics than statistics, but one is just built on top of the other, right? So we're just increasing in complexity. And actually, I was uh, listening to some interesting stuff recently about emergent properties of highly complex systems and whether consciousness, this has been an ongoing debate for a while, right? Is consciousness something inherent and a natural property, or is it just an emergent property of the complexity of what's going on in our brains? I don't think we're going to come up with an answer today in this conversation or anytime probably in the next few decades. But I think it's a really interesting way to kind of approach it because from the artificial side or the machine intelligence side, we are also approaching degrees of complexity where we are struggling to find the emergent properties, right? When a lot of people say neural networks, deep neural networks especially, are black boxes. What they really mean is that they don't have an emergent conceptual understanding of what this thing is doing, right? There's no intuitive way to relate it to how we experience reality. We know exactly what it's doing mathematically. It's an algorithm, like we can write the equations, But writing the equations is not the same thing as knowing in a human sense or a human relatable sense what the neural network is really experiencing. That's ultimately what we're asking is, right, what is the experience of the neural network and how is it arriving at the decisions it's presenting us with. And so like I was saw a thing recently where someone used a 26 layer neural network to do video analysis of human motion to try to identify types of motion and classify. And I was like, 26 layers, like in my dreams, right? And it's happening now because we have the computational power. So, well, maybe our brain is, a few orders of magnitude above that, but we're gonna get there. Um, and at that point, it really starts begging the question to me: is the machine any different from us?
Let's sort of get to the fascinating thing of often when we think of sort of strong AI, we think of that as human-like AI, but I think that's in some ways that's avoiding part of the interesting question of do we really care if it's human-like or are we looking for something that's as complicated as a human in whatever way it is?
Right. Yeah, and that's where I think I really try to separate and be careful with using intelligence versus consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think consciousness is a very human experience, or maybe not even just human, but it's an experience of living beings, right? Versus intelligence, which I think a non living creation, like a sufficiently sophisticated piece of software, could be an intelligence. And one of the things I do with machinehood in the manifesto is talk about machine intelligences and the rights of machine intelligences, because when they do arrive at that complexity, um, it comes to their human masters, which at this point we are, right? Uh, to decide whether we emancipate them and give them the rights of, living intelligences. And I think that's maybe a way to kind of groove into that particular question of, does it matter? And I think it does matter. I think that conscious experience and the distinction of something that's alive versus something that's constructed is an important distinction. In what way we choose to make it important from a legal standpoint, from moral and ethical standpoints, that is what I think we really need to explore, these next few decades. Hopefully we get some good answers on how we want to treat these machine intelligences before they catch up to us. Because at that point, I feel like it's going to be too late and we're going to make a lot of the same mistakes human beings have made historically with each other, with animal rights, with the environment, in so many ways of having that potential to abuse the thing before you recognize that the thing has equal value.
I think one of the interesting things about this space is the extent to which it shows the inseparability of things like ethics and philosophy from the advance of science. That we can't just go out and build new intelligences and push the envelope of what these things are capable of without, at least if we want to be responsible, asking these questions of what are our responsibilities to them, what are our responsibilities to each other. And that's one of the things I think is, I don't know, perhaps most interesting is that we think about our responsibilities to other intelligences, and frequently people building software aren't even thinking about our responsibilities to the other human intelligences we're working with.
Yeah, that's fair. um, yes, not just our coworkers, but also the consumers, right? The end users and all of the ethical pitfalls we have already stumbled into when it comes to face recognition technology, when it comes to deep fakes, when it comes to privacy and ownership of data. These things are happening so quickly. Um, I think in some ways it's been good to have at least science fiction literature to turn to, because I feel like that's a space where people actually have asked these questions and at least try to think about them and come up with potential answers. I mean, sometimes you have just the people raising the red flags, which are the dystopic stories, but you also have a lot of people trying to figure out how, we live together with other forms of intelligence as well as other forms of life, whether it's aliens, which can be a stand-in for just other human cultures that we don't understand. But I think aliens at this point could also be a good stand-in for machine intelligences, when they reach that level of complexity and sophistication. And kind of circling back to the whole emergent properties, that's the one place I think where we're all really struggling right now is how do we relate to what the machine intelligences are doing, right? And if and when, if or when, I assume it's going to be a when, because I think software engineers and people in data science are already working on this. When we figure out what those emergent properties are in terms of helping us relate to what these machine intelligences are doing, at that point, empathy kicks in real hard, right? Because it's like, oh, wait, we have that gut feeling now of what this thing is doing. We can relate to it on a human level, and that's when it's gonna, I think, that's when you're really gonna start seeing people now having this recognition and realization that, wait a minute, is it okay that we are doing these things to these machines? Should they have rights of their own? And if so, what are those rights? And also, what are the responsibilities? I went to, right before the pandemic, I think about like 2 weeks before, I was at an interesting AI conference at UC Irvine, where they brought in a lot of people from the humanities and not a lot of people from the tech side. And so they were really kind of looking at it from this aspect of, you build the machine, but you also give birth to the child, right? And at some point, do you consider it an independent entity? And at what point does it reach maturity to where it's responsible for its own actions, right? Whether those are creative, if the computer, I noticed you had Yuza on your
Yes.
Twitch stream a few weeks ago, and it's like, so does he have to list his, GPT-2 or GPT-3 neural network as his co-author for his books, right? Is there a responsibility there for him to give credit to that neural network? Does the neural network get to have a legacy beyond its lifespan? And similarly, on the darker side of things or the negative side of things, if the AI is used to commit a crime, if it's used for a deep fake, or if it's used to break some sort of cryptography and steal money, is the AI culpable? Is the creator of the AI culpable? Is there, ownership? Are there rights that go with that ownership? So I think these are starting to become relevant almost today. Maybe not quite today, but for creation, I think disclosure is potentially important, right? If you submit a work of fiction or art to a contest. We had a story in Escape Pod about this, actually, where a young woman builds a neural network, trains it on a bunch of data from and about her younger brother, and then with that neural network, or actually, I think the neural network ultimately produces a poem that she submits to a poetry contest and it wins. And she's talking about it with her friend, and she's like, well, I don't feel like I won the contest because I didn't write it. The neural network wrote it. And her friend was like, but you wrote the neural network and you made the neural network. So it's sort of like a parent taking credit for their child's accomplishments, right? If your child wins a poetry contest, you had hopefully a lot to do with shaping that child and their environment, their artistic ability, their genetics, obviously. And you facilitated the ability for the child to write the poem and to send it in and win this contest. So obviously you take some pride in the accomplishment, but do you take credit?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And then the sort of even the further wrinkle on that is if you are training this network on a specific other person, what's their role in relation to the output? If sort of their actions were the input to the net.
Right. Much like with clones, right? The clone, I think, question is a little bit easier because a clone is not that different from a twin, right? It's just someone who's genetically identical to you, but not necessarily you. And I would say a similar principle would apply to a machine intelligence. If the machine intelligence is modeled after a specific person, it's still not that person. It's its own person. It's not going to be an identical replica of them. So it's not that different from a clone of a human being. And I can see us, we're starting to tread some of these waters in things like movies, right?
Oh yeah.
I think it was the last, yeah, it was the Last Jedi that had um, young Princess Leia at the end, right? So it was young Carrie Fisher after she had passed away, but they managed to reconstruct, reconstruct a full 3D realistic rendition of her just from past footage.
Mm-hmm.
And so when that piece, which requires a high degree of processing today, gets put together with the neural network, which also requires a high degree of processing today, in 10 or 15 years, you might have her talking to you, you might have her speech patterns modeled, you might have her verbal mannerisms modeled, right? And so it's going to become, we're going to go past the uncanny valley into straight up creepy, right?
And of course, then it's going to become normal in some way because that's sort of the path of technologies. They, first they're a dream, then they're a weird reality, and then they're commonplace.
They are, but then you start getting into these ethical conundrums, right? What if you copy someone who's alive? It's one thing if you're doing this for someone who's dead. Already there are issues in terms of their estate and their legacy and lack of consent because they're dead. But what happens if they're alive and you have mimicked them in some way and you're fooling other people into thinking that they're actually talking to this person?
And even absent issues of consent, there are moral issues with that, even if the person is completely willing to go along. I mean, a celebrity who does this to allow people to have one-on-one encounters with them, do they have an obligation to disclose that the person did not have a one-on-one encounter with them, but with a very convincing replica?
And does it matter? This kind of comes back to consciousness, right?
Yeah.
So right now, as far as we know, and as we presume, you need a body and a brain and blood in order to have that consciousness. The holy grail for a lot of people working in AI, in generalized AI, is not just machine intelligence, but machine consciousness. Right? And the struggle there right now is, unlike with intelligence and neural networks, we have no idea how consciousness is manifested from the physical reality of our brain. Like, a lot of people have theories right now. There's some good ways that they're trying to model and encapsulate it, but there's no consensus, and there's not even much supporting evidence for a lot of it, right? So this is sort of like in the early days of physics, where it's like, yeah, okay, like, we know it exists, or at least we think it exists because we feel it and we perceive it, but we don't know how to codify it. And until we know how to codify it, how do we reproduce it, right? Are we sure we are reproducing it? And is a sufficiently convincing fake good enough, right? Is it a case of, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it is a duck? Or are we going to say that, no, it's some inherent emergent property that requires, biology and like organic compounds in order to actually be called consciousness. So I think that's another one of these questions that really fascinates me, because initially I will say that I kind of fell on the argument of consciousness will be something that we will model, or it'll, emerge naturally with sufficient complexity and generalization of intelligence, right? That when intelligence becomes complex enough with sufficient sensory modalities, consciousness will emerge as a property of that structure. But I will say that today, having spent more time listening to philosophers and thinking about it, and also seeing where we're going computationally, I am not as convinced if that's going to happen. And if consciousness truly is just an emergent property of intelligence and sensory input output, I think there could be something more interesting there. I mean, I'm not spiritual, so I'm not going to say that it is something outside the physical plane of reality. I think it's still grounded, because as far as we know, once we die, we're not conscious, or at least the dead creature is not conscious to us, right? We cannot perceive its consciousness anymore. So there is something there in physical structure, which means we ought to be able to figure it out and replicate it eventually. But whether that physical structure is the same structure that encodes intelligence, that's where I'm less sure at this point. And I think that's a space I have a lot of fun with from a speculative fiction standpoint, right? Because it's like, here's a sandbox that is pretty well undisturbed at this point and also unexplored. And so we can have a lot of fun with delving into, what if the answer there is no, consciousness is not an emergent property of intelligence. It is some other emergent property of our physicality. Which I could segue into panpsychism if we want to go there. But
Well, I am frequently up for going into panpsychism.
That's been my new fun toy for science fiction lately, which is, okay, let's assume the answer is no. Could something like the concept of panpsychism, which says that every physical piece of matter in the universe has a property of consciousness, and that our consciousness is an emergent property of our being a really complex collection of matter and energy, right? And so I think, I don't know, I find that really fascinating, especially Philip Goff's take on panpsychism and coming into it. I think he also has a physics background. So he's coming into it as a scientist who wants to try to model consciousness as well. And if consciousness is, an inherent property of matter like mass and energy, can we fit it into standard models of physics? And if we can do that, will it eventually answer, how conscious experience fits in with the rest of the physical properties of our universe? And I take that and I groove it into AI because AI. And it's like, well, in that case, we'll have to figure out how that model ends up working, right? Before we can then figure out how to reconstruct consciousness using other forms of matter, right? So whether it's silicon or something else, in order to reproduce consciousness, it could be that it's not just a matter of having really complicated code and really, really powerful processors. It might be something with how we inherently structure our chips. And it could be that the way we build chips today and using transistor gate logic is not going to allow us to reproduce consciousness, that we're going to have to build our artificial minds using some other base technology that is not what we have today. And who knows, maybe a century from now, we'll figure that out and it will create a whole new revolution, right? Like we've had the digital revolution at this point, but maybe we need the consciousness revolution. That's a whole new form of technology.
One of the things sort of I think about there is the experience of consciousness is often sort of an introspective one. It's looking at the decisions you make and thinking about why you made those decisions. And that is interesting to me from the perspective of the sort of panpsychism, different emergent properties of you need to both have something happening and something that can look at that system of things happening.
Right. Yeah, so you need the senses, right? You need the way that you can interact with the world, and you need that concept of environmental affordances, right?
Mhm.
Actions that you can take, things you can interact with. Without that, it becomes pure introspection, which, on the one hand, is virtual reality in a lot of ways, right? It's all up here, and there's nothing physical. But then I also have to. I think that also begs the question: what really is the difference there, right? um, is is it important and necessary to have the physical past a point? Is it sufficient to have the virtual experience? Do you need to have the physical reality, the physical experience, or is the physical experience simply a stepping stone on the way to greater abstraction and, next level intelligence?
One of the things that sort of I end up wondering about, thinking about AI and the development of machine intelligence, is so much of our experience of as humans is grounded in our senses, in seeing things, touching things, and for many of these sort of other systems, they're going to be developing in a very different environment with very different inputs and ways to interact, and sort of the alienness that seems like it could create in our attempt to communicate.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, right now, the vast majority of machine intelligences in terms of what we have today in software do not interact with the real world at all, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we feed them abstracted data and they give us back abstracted outputs. And other than the actual robots that are being built, which admittedly there are some of those, right? But outside of the robots, the super complex 26 layer deep learning system has no interaction with the physical world whatsoever. It's complete abstraction, right? It's like putting a human in a sensory tank and just, jacking in Matrix style and feeding them a fake version of the world, right?
It's almost worse than that because in a lot of cases just a snapshot, and then they're asked to predict things, but they're only given a single update of the world, and then from there's no world model, just content.
Right. There's no context, I think, is maybe what you're trying to say, right? That
I
it's
and Yeah.
lacking the larger context of the world, or are you saying just because we're giving it a limited set of data?
Well, I think for a lot of the systems we're looking at, that we initialize them with a very large set of data, but they don't continually refresh themselves. They're not in a process of continuous observation. And in fact, the subsequent interactions they have where they're asked to judge data are a snapshot. There's a process in which they learn, which occurs off of one snapshot. And then there's a process in which, without being able to update their own thinking, they spit out answers.
Yeah, and I think honestly, there's a good reason for that, right? Which is, at least for most of the systems we've been talking about so far, these are considered supervised learning systems, meaning someone is teaching the system what the right answer is to each of um, the questions or the data that's presented, right? So during that learning phase, much like again with children, you have a teacher who's saying this is right, this is wrong, so that you can learn. And then later, you simply make a decision. Of course, for us, most of us continue to learn and adapt, and we also decay as we get older, right? Even when we're younger, we have biological processes of decay. So that constant need to learn and update is important. But when you release a neural network system or machine intelligence software into the wild, there's no more teacher. And for us as humans, while we may not have an actual instructor telling us right from wrong, we have social context and cues and the environment itself giving us feedback on whether we're making right decisions or not, versus when we release these software systems, they're no longer supervised. So we don't want them to learn and adapt, because if they learn and adapt to the wrong thing, they're going to produce wrong decisions. This is where we kind of come back to, of course, who decides right from wrong. So it's all based on, the software designers and the people who've spec'd out the system to determine what is right and wrong. So if they make a mistake up front, it just propagates and then it becomes fixed. Not unlike, certain human beings with very fixed worldviews.
And that gets at, too, for us as we do our processing and as we test the world. While a lot of our things are sort of social, abstract, conceptual things, one of the biggest ways we're constantly calibrating is, for example, when you throw a ball, you predict where it's going to end up. And when, somebody's playing catch, you're constantly updating that prediction based on you have a source of ground truth. Your senses tell you, well, where did the ball actually end up? I anticipated it would end up here. It actually ended up here. Okay.
Right. And there is no externality for software in that sense. I think it'll be really interesting as we deploy more and more robots for use in the field, right? That I think, or self-driving cars for that matter, right? Whether I don't know, honestly, actually, I haven't looked into those systems, whether they freeze the neural networks so that they stop adapting, or whether they let them to continue to train and adapt even after being deployed.
For at least some of them, my understanding is they have a hybrid model where the ones that are deployed do not themselves adapt, but the data from them is gathered, is centrally computed, and then a new version is pushed out. And that version has taken in the information from all the instances. So it's kind of this phased process where they keep control,
Okay.
which at least sort of works, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. And that kind of resolves this issue of not having a supervisor, right? And so the supervisor gets to provide that larger context. I don't know, like as we start sending more robots to places like Mars, or let's say the deep ocean, right? Places where it's harder for us to have that sort of feedback mechanism where we can collect large amounts of data and then update them. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens if we let them continue to adapt. And I think there will be a lot of incentive for people to develop systems like reinforcement learning, actually, is probably a really good example, where we give the machine a goal, right? And it can come up with different ways of getting to that goal. And maybe it will better adapt to the realities of its situation that we cannot anticipate if we allow it that freedom to change its programming, right? The fundamental programming, when I say changes programming, I can hear people who don't know what I mean going like, oh no, it's going to reprogram itself to like kill everybody. No, the fundamental structure and programming is going to be the same, right? Just like our neurons are always neurons, but the way in which those neurons configure themselves, or the way in which the robot's neural network can configure itself to new input or a new path to its goal, might make it more adaptable and therefore have better success at whatever it is we want it to do than the system of waiting for it to come back to us with its results and then retraining it and deploying it again, right? Because that's much slower turnover. And this requires some degree of confidence from us, the creator, right? That it can handle these sorts of adaptations on the fly. But I think it's pretty plausible that in the next 20, 30 years, we'll be able to do that, especially for robotics that have very, concrete, specific goals, right? Even the vacuum cleaners, which it's one of those things where I think science fiction writers failed to anticipate that this was going to be the vanguard of robots in the household. But the vacuum cleaner, um, they've been changing them from sort of these really simplistic rules based, like I bump into a thing, let's just randomly try a new direction and see if I bump into another thing, to building maps and having goals and reinforcing over time how to accomplish this goal of, let's say, cleaning the room while bumping into the furniture the least amount, right? We have that inherently. We have a pain response when we bump into stuff that says, hey, quit bumping into stuff, like figure out how to navigate the world without constantly bumping into stuff. We're effectively trying to teach the robots that hopefully it doesn't feel like pain to them, but really that's kind of ultimately the mechanism, right? It's like you have a goal and you have a thing that's preventing you from getting to that goal, and that is a sort of pain, right? It is a negative feedback, and you let them learn and they get more sophisticated and they get more autonomous or independent, right? Which ultimately is our goal for any child of ours, whether it's biological or artificial, I would say.
I feel like with that, we're almost getting back to that question of intelligence versus consciousness again, in the sense that avoiding a negative stimulus is intelligence. Pain feels like it's a conscious experience.
Yeah, because it's a qualitative thing that we share with other forms of life, I would say. Right? We can see when another person or another animal um, is feeling pain, and it is an experience that we recognize as something that we share. I do think that, I don't know, like I don't know if pain would necessarily have to tie into consciousness, other than the fact that it is this experiential way of describing what's happening to us. Um, but the funny thing is, a lot of people will project the experience of pain onto machines today, right? Like we were just talking about vacuum cleaner. When the vacuum cleaner does go bump its little head sensor against the bookshelf, like I have an instinctive reaction to be like, ow, like you just bumped into
You
it,
flinch a little.
right? Situationally. And so that comes back to, that goes way into philosophy, but it goes into the whole like, do I really know you're feeling pain? Or am I just always projecting your experience based on my reality and my experiences of pain? And therefore, are we sure the machine doesn't feel pain? Like, is there any way for us to really know for a fact that it's not feeling pain? I mean, this is the kind of questions people ask about like tiny creatures, right? Like, when we step on the poor ant, like, does the ant feel pain? Do we know? Like, we have enough biology understanding now to be like, okay, we know that when you stimulate a nerve ending, a certain type of nerve ending that is a pain receptor, that it is going to cause the experience of pain to humans. And we know higher order animals that have these neurons that we can find in their anatomy, that they're going to also experience it the same way we assume that we experience it.
We see the same reactions, at least.
We see it, but we also know that they share our biology, right?
Exactly.
So they have that physiology, they have the anatomy, they have the brains, they have the nerve endings. What about the ones that don't have the nerve endings, though? Does that still count as pain, or is it qualitatively some other experience? And if it is qualitatively some other experience, does that make it less valuable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do we have to give it less weight because it's a qualitatively different experience? Or do we consider it equally detrimental, right? Just in a different modality.
It was sort of, this feels like it's very much into those questions of philosophy, and especially sort of philosophy with a slight overlap into ethics, of just like, what is consciousness? What is experience?
And what are our responsibilities to other beings?
Yeah.
In one of the questions that we think about here is if we have these responsibilities to AIs, I mean, do we have them to animals? Do we have them to particularly higher order animals? Where do we? One of the coherent, I suppose, ways to draw this line would be to say, no, we don't have them to AIs. We don't have them to animals. Humans for humans. Go humans.
Yeah. So when I was drawing up the manifesto for machinehood, I read up on the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and I also went back and read the Communist Manifesto, and I kind of smashed these things together. And one of the things I was thinking about was um, pretty much as you're saying, but starting with animal rights and extrapolating from there to machine rights. But along the way, when it comes to human rights,
Mhm.
we don't have the best record of humans for humans, right?
No, we really don't.
We have exploited other human beings since the start of human history, and we are still struggling and fighting for human rights in for many types of humans. And so we don't really have a good track record. And then with animals, it's even worse. I mean, we have been exploiting animals without their consent from day one, right? When we milked the first cow or harnessed the first horse to a chariot or a wagon, we never asked the animal if it's okay, right? Partly because we don't know how to. But that's not entirely true. Like, we do obtain consent from our dogs and cats, for example. We understand when the animals, even cows and horses, don't like what we're doing to them, right? When they have a negative reaction, that is an experience that we can relate to. Um, uh, a big danger I think we have with robots and machine intelligence is not just science fictionally, is that we are going to abuse them, not the other way around. Like, all of Hollywood and a lot of pop culture conceptions of AI up until now have been the AIs um, being violent towards us, right? Usually as a reaction of us being shitty human beings towards them in the first place, which is fine. It's a very human way of relating to the AI, saying that, an animal that is kicked and abused is going to fight back. But we're building these AI systems and we're effectively brainwashing them not to be able to fight back. So at that point, they're not going to respond the same way other living creatures do. They're not going to have that survival instinct. They're not going to have a self-defense instinct necessarily either. And so we have the potential to exploit them for much longer and for far worse, I think, than we have even with other human beings, which does not bode well for us. I mean, I guess as someone who would like human beings to be more ethical going forward, and who thinks that overall the long arm of human history has been one that's been progressive and towards improving rights for all living creatures, I would hope that we do our best and we kind of try to put our best foot forward when it comes to artificial life. That is, I really think, it's on our doorstep for the next century. I know a lot of people don't think that far ahead. It's outside any of our 3 lifetimes, most probably. I won't even say that with certitude, but most probably it's outside our lifetimes. But it's not that far away either. And it also kind of dovetails. We haven't really gotten into the cyborg thing, but when it comes to human machine hybrids, right? And as that hybridization, um, percentage starts increasing, again, it's like, how are we going to treat these people? Where are we going to draw these lines of, who deserves rights and who deserves autonomy?
This actually relates to a comment that came up in the chat, talking about basically, we talked earlier about having these sort of AIs as children that grow to independence, but if they do not grow to independence for whatever reason, whether that's because the system is too simple or or we brainwash them so they can't, does that make them somehow less deserving of rights? You know, it's that question again of what is our moral requirement toward a system.
Yeah, I think I come from Eastern philosophy, strong foundations in, I won't even say I was raised Hindu. My family is Hindu, though my dad was an atheist, so I was kind of raised in between. But Hindu philosophy, differently from the religion, and also Buddhist philosophy, different from the religion. Eastern philosophy in general, I think, doesn't draw as hard and fast lines between animals and humans as Western philosophy does. And so I feel like my grounding is such that we always have a moral responsibility to everything in our environment. Living things maybe more than non-living things, but I would say given our modern context of climate change, of pollution, of how we understand ecosystems and how tightly interwoven those ecosystems are, that we have a moral responsibility to our environment, even the inanimate parts of our environment as well. And it's not necessarily just a purely altruistic endeavor either. I mean, it is for the good of the species' health in the long run too, right? And I think from a emotional health standpoint, um, a lot of people are empathetic. A lot of people are altruistic, and they're not gonna feel good about abusing the machines if they feel like they can relate to the machines, right? Again, if we have emergent properties from artificial life to where we can actually relate to their experiences of the world, we're gonna have a lot of very upset people when you kick their robot dog. So maybe yeah. So I kind of I come from the more expansive standpoint of, yeah, we should have a moral responsibility towards the things we build as well as the things that we give birth to or raise on a farm or whatever. And this goes into the very complicated question of vegetarianism, but I kind of feel like, again, in the next century, like we're already coming up with plant-based proteins that will supplant animal-based proteins that are both, more sustainable and cruelty-free, at least to the animals. They're not very nice to the plants, potentially. Plants that's a whole other thing, right? Where, when it comes to insects and plants and sort of these lower consciousness forms of life, where does our survivability tie into our moral responsibility towards those things, much like with the environment, right? Where does ensuring quality of life and survivability for a human blend into ensuring the survivability of the things that we have to consume in order to exist? I don't know. These are very, very difficult ethical questions. And I think the easy answer, speculatively, but even, in terms of wish fulfillment for a lot of people, is post-scarcity, right? Oh, if only we had enough stuff, it wouldn't matter. Like, we wouldn't have to do any of these things. But we're approaching post-scarcity in a lot of things today in a lot of parts of the world. Not all parts of the world, for sure. There are many places that are still living in poverty, that are still living without meeting their basic needs and basic human rights. But there are other places, including the US and Canada and much of Europe, where food is abundant. We're producing and throwing away more clothes than we know what to do with. We have a homeless problem, but that is more a policy problem than a true lack of shelter problem. We could build shelters to help.
We could achieve post-scarcity if the resources were put in the right places.
Right. So in spite of that, or maybe because of it, post-scarcity also implies a massive degree of consumption, which ends up being detrimental to the environment. So it's like, how do we balance this goal of not needing for anything with living in a way that's moral and sustainable for the future, not just for the present.
I think that exposes to some extent the underlying consumerist mentality of post scarcity. The idea that post scarcity means having everything you desire, not necessarily having everything you need. And we live in a world of amplified desires where, where to make our economy run, people are encouraged to want. So if you want for any, if you want for nothing and you still have amplified desires, then of course you're going to be consuming constantly.
But what or who decides what you need versus what you want? Um,
I don't have an answer to that.
I was going to say, case in point, the pandemic, right?
Mm-hmm.
We need broadband. Every household today in some parts of the world, like South Korea, have broadband provided by their government. The US does not, and we're suffering for it right now, right? Look at, I saw a picture today in the LA Times of kids sitting outside Taco Bell to do school because they need the Wi-Fi. And they don't have reliable enough signal or power or whatever at home that they can do it from home. And so need, I think, becomes a moving goalpost. Like,
Absolutely.
do you need your cell phone? Do you need the internet? But in a lot of ways today, you do need it. You need it in order to be able to work and earn money to then provide yourself food, clothing, shelter, and some of these more basic needs, right? So so I feel like post scarcity is a thing that we're never going to reach. Like we're all, it's the carrot dangling at the end of the stick that we're just always going to be chasing, because we're going to have a bunch of things that we used to need, and it's like, okay, we have those, we have an abundance of those, but now we're chasing after the next thing, right? We're chasing after renewable energy, we're chasing after clean water, we're chasing after greater communications, we're chasing after space travel. We're chasing after general travel, like the grounding of jet planes, right? Jet planes, I have a huge moral conflict there because I want to be good to the environment, but I love traveling. And it's like, okay, so how do we build cleaner jet planes? The answer is not, we're not going to travel anymore. We don't want to deprive ourselves of a thing, especially once we have it. But we also want to minimize its harm. And the same thing with space travel. I was talking to someone about the realities of commercial space travel. And it's like, even if we have renewable rockets blasting off all the time, which like in my book in Machinehood, which takes place about 75 years from now, I've posited that, we've commercialized rocketry enough that there are clubs all over the world that are able to do small launches off launch pads on the ocean, right? So you have rockets going off all the time, but those rockets require fuel. They are probably polluting the atmosphere. I don't know to what extent, not that much today, but if you have them going up and down all the time, it's gonna, just like with jet planes, there's gonna be all these consequences. But but I want to go to space. Like I want to have commercial space travel, or with Tesla's constellations. Like we want to have universal internet access, especially to places that don't have infrastructure, and that is a noble goal. And then we have the unintended consequences of more junk in our atmosphere, right? And now more light pollution for the poor astronomers.
Yep.
Who are trying to see and observe at night. So yeah, I think this idea that somehow we'll meet all our needs at some point and we'll say enough is enough is just completely against the grain of human nature, right? We're always going to want more. There will be maybe a percentage of our population that's happy with what they have, but a significant portion is going to be ambitious, is going to have desires, is going to be looking to the next thing, just because that's what we do.
I think one of the things this gets at is things are never simple. It's not that you're post scarcity or not. You maybe have enough of some things but not enough of others. And ethics is not sort of a ethical or not either. It's things are more or less ethical in various ways, and it's about balancing those ethics against each other.
Right. Yeah, it's about recognizing that it's a spectrum and not even a one-dimensional spectrum, a multi-dimensional spectrum on many axes. Yeah.
So this seems like a good place for us to wind things up today. But before we go, of course, the thing I always want to ask is, where can folks find you and your stuff when you're not here chatting with us?
So you can find all of my fiction on my website, sbdivya.com. You can find a little bit about my new book, Machinehood, which comes out March 2021 on machinehood.com, including a very brief little teaser from the Machinehood's manifesto, as well as some other fun stuff. And you can find me on Twitter at Divya's Tweets. Oh, and you can find me on Escape Pod, where I am co-editor, occasional episode host, and I will throw out a little promo for Escape Pod's first ever print anthology, which is coming out in October.
Oh, very cool.
After 15 years of podcasting, Escape Pod was the original science fiction podcast, and we are celebrating by putting out an anthology of mix of original and reprint fiction from some of our authors who have launched into phenomenal careers and some up-and-coming stars.
Oh, that is awesome. Again, thank you so much for joining us here today. It was really great, really interesting conversation, and I apologize for our technical difficulties.
Not at all. Thank you so much for having me. I always enjoy talking about these topics and wish I had more time to. So thanks for providing me a good excuse to spend an hour philosophizing.
Real glad to.
We'll just have to do it again sometime. All right, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to wrap things up on Twitch. So thanks to everybody in the audience who was here watching with us today, and we'll see you soon.